Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're good. I'm Jack Chew. This is Chewing It Over, and we go live Mondays and Fridays, 12:30 till 1 o'clock. This is episode number, what we on? 233. And it's called Just Do Your Rotations and Other Naff Career Advice. And so a bit of a declaration there, isn't there, in the title, of course, as to why I think that. And I will explain why I think that's naff career advice. I hate that intro. That is not ours, really. That's me using one of the stock ones, weird, spooky UFO thing. And it's partly to remind me and to encourage me to get finalized on the new intro videos that you've got to look forward to. Because the last one used to blare out in your ears and you always used to complain. And so I've been working on a new one. But yeah, hope you're good. Hope you had a good weekend. Been looking forward to doing this show. It comes ahead of this evening's webinar that we've got, which is now sold out for by the Physio Matters clinical mentoring team are doing a webinar tonight about career options and stuff. And so they'll get into more detail and have Q&A and much, they'll be able to get their many voices across that topic. But I thought we'd do a show on that theme because it's such an interesting and contentious area where bias is cut in various different ways, including my own. And I wanted to just try and give a reflection as well as my take on it, and to see what your thoughts are as well. If you're going to tune in live, or if you're like most people coming at this after the fact and you want to share, then please do put your thoughts where you're listening to this in the comments, or email info@physio-matters.com, and that will find its way back to me with regards to your opinion, which will then naturally influence mine, as well as influence other shows that we might do to this effect or beyond. Now, what are we getting at? Because I know we sometimes have an international audience, and so it might be unclear as to what we're referring to with regards to band 5. What the hell does that mean? But essentially, rotations are intradisciplinary rotations within physiotherapy, typically, that you would then graduate from your bachelor's in physiotherapy, and it's encouraged that your junior position, which is what a band 5 is, essentially a junior physiotherapy role, that would often be a rotational post, whereby every 6 months, most common now, used to be every 4 would be the most common. Now every 6 months you rotate, say between neuro, say stroke rehab, you have an MSK placement, you might be on the respiratory ward, you might then do a medical community rotation, you might, and there's all sorts of different versions of this. But the thing that the title's alluding to is that it's sort of a typical, it's such a typical career pathway that many have done, that then that becomes the go-to advice, is that you don't want to subspecialize early, and that you therefore want to do your rotations to get a breadth before you then specialize. And there's good reason for that advice, by the way, right? It's not to dismiss that advice at all. The reason why I'm mocking it somewhat in the title, or why you would find people like me, or me specifically, saying don't just take that advice as read, and why that is naff career advice, is it does not account for your needs and views, right? If someone is saying just do your rotations without follow-up, without an understanding of your specific needs, that's the bit that's concerning. And the more times recently than ever, I hear that, where someone, the classic is that a student begs the question, do you have any advice for me as to when I go out into the big wide world? It's almost like a default answer is, I'd say just do your rotations first. And that's what I think is naff career advice, because they don't have a clue. They're just cookie cutting either what they've done or what they perceive to be the best option. It's something that they're throwing back to when that might have been the right generic advice. I just think it's I don't know. I don't think I like low hanging fruit, positions on this. It just feels like it's too easy to say that without actually tailoring it, right? But equally, it might have been a one-off back and forth conversation that you're having. They're not going to get into the weeds of what your individual needs are. But that, for me, is the default answer. It's like completely depends on what you want, what you're after, how confident you are that you'd be able to identify what it is you want to specialize in at this early stage. What is the dream job? Well, what's your dream job in 5, 10, 20 years? What is your likely trajectory? even what your family circumstances. The amount of people that are asking that question, that's the last thing they want to hear because of the likelihood of them wanting to say even work in the NHS as a sector. There's all sorts of different things that you should be considering. And so the reason why just do your rotations is naff career advice isn't because it's never good career advice. It's just that it's not tailoring anything. The word just is doing a lot of work there, right? You need to think about all the different variables affecting it. Now, historically, and that's where I want to start, right? So I'm going to just throw my take out there, and please do put your questions in, any comments you might have. To ask you guys a direct question, if you're tuning in live, what are your thoughts on this? If you're, is it something that you have a gut thrust answer to? Are you someone that has said, just do your rotations, even though you don't know their individual circumstances? Are you someone that's heard that yourself, whereby someone who doesn't understand the who's and ahs of what variables you're contending with has just ended up giving that either unsolicited or solicited advice to just do your rotations? Because I understand where it comes from, I feel. I think I've maybe even been sucked into making that mistake before, which I consider a mistake now. But I just wonder what your thoughts are. So have you heard that before? Is that something you've given or received before? And what are your thoughts? But I'm just going to close off my chat function for now and get stuck into just riffing on this for a bit, if that's okay. So the history of it, and I don't know when it started. It's not as if I've done a deep dive into the history books, but it's just that classically you would graduate into what was the sought after positions were rotational jobs within large teaching hospitals, and also then even community trusts, formerly primary care trusts, or you'd just end up having a set of, and you used to look for the big ones. You've got rotations into orthopedics, into neuro, into respiratory, into MSK. You were looking for this breadth to be able to then rotate around that. And then at that point, when I graduated, you were looking at like 4 months was the classic. And so you were then thinking, right, in 2 years of being a junior, I could have done these things and got a good breadth. And depending on whether you had that as a student, that might be what you're craving because you're trying to work out what to subspecialize in. And so the thing that you would classically do is what I've just described. But that was various different times. It's been a buyer or a seller's market, but there were sought after jobs, and you also, especially those that were attached to a university city, right? So I qualified from Nottingham, and so your university, what's it called, NUH. Nottingham University hospitals were the two main. To get your rotations there, you'd be able to stay local to where you'd fallen in love with. Typically, everyone falls in love with their uni cities, etc. And so you wanted to then rotate within those disciplines, even if you went further afield or what have you. You were looking for those rotations, and the big one is that you were wanting to get the extension to university experience in a sense that you were being taken under the wing of experienced clinicians, and then in a position where you were being taught, got up to speed. You were extending what was, you only did 4 and 6 week placements. You were then getting a chance to have 4 or 6 months to get your teeth into what it meant to be a qualified member of staff under the appropriate supervision of senior clinicians, because you're likely, especially in that circumstance I've just described, to be nested within a team with line management that are directly clinical in amongst the same team. You're going to be delegated patients. You're not going to be needing to take much in way of direct leadership at that position. And so but the reason I'm referring to that is history, because it's not that that's not still the case in many departments, but there's many things that have ended up stretching that. But also my world is the world of MSK. It's my specialism. That's what I often talk about, and that's what I'm most passionate about. Although, as I've said before, my passion for rehabilitation naturally bridges across interdisciplinary far more than it used to. But the way in which now that might not be the best option is that used to be such a great shout, because you'd then get that support structure and supervision pretty much regardless of where you went. And so I'm throwing back quite a way now, but you say 10 to 12 years ago when I was in that situation, you were in a situation then where you were getting that exposure. You had that arm around you and the support network that would mean that you would be able to bring that through, and you really would get a breadth of knowledge. But if you imagine then that you're not always going to be in that situation these days. There's a lot of people that are reporting increasing amounts of isolation. I'm not necessarily just describing from COVID now, but over time, various stresses and strains on the NHS, as well as a bit of a hollowing out of the middle of the pack with regards to sort of senior, classically band 6 and junior band 7 support for juniors. It's going to be that they kind of need to see more patients. There's fewer of them. In my world, it's been sort of hollowed out by way of new physio schools emerging, that they go and then beyond the teaching faculty. You've got people that have gone on to be FCPs or old money ESPs in secondary care. You've then got people going into, say, private practice or other enterprise, in part because the waiting lists in NHS services have then started to struggle. Therefore, if you're even in your stroke physio, you're able to go and see quite a high price point that you can put on in insurance cases, as well as cash pay in the private sector, even in things like neuro and pediatrics, or less so in respiratory, but you've still got your sort of cardiac rehab or community care for elderly. So there's lots of other options there. That's mean that there's been this hollowing out to some degree of the senior staff. That means that there's just fewer people to throw an arm around you and be leaders and mentors. Now, there's some fantastic, and there's thousands of fantastic mentors and leaders within these NHS departments and teams across disciplines. But there's also areas in which there's big holes. And I would argue that there's more holes now. I'd love to know the data in more detail, and definitely would have any of you on the show if you feel that you'd be able to bring more hard details and data to bear on this, especially if it then cuts against my instincts here. But certainly from what we're hearing people that are feeling quite isolated in some of those positions. And so one of the major upsides of doing your rotations was then the support that you would have, as well as the exposure. If it's just exposure without support, then that can be quite a daunting thing, and especially if you've got a bias towards certain disciplines and sectors, sorry, not sectors, disciplines is the right word, rather than others, then you might think that, right, I just feel like I really want to upskill in neuro or experience neuro. If you just go and experience neuro and you're in some sort of situation where you're not then, for whatever reason, best efforts of the system and the staff within it, not able to be supported or brought through, then that exposure alone isn't necessarily going to, depending on your disposition, I guess, is not necessarily going to do what you're hoping it would do. And so if you then were doing that because you wanted to just experience that, then that on its own wouldn't necessarily help you get ahead. Depends on how much of a rush you're in. You might just be like, look, if I need to go through the motions and just find my feet for this amount of years or whatever, then so be it. But there's others that have got an ambition to over certain time frames, or there might be a slightly more mature student that then wants to get ahead. They know that they want, say, MSK, or they know they want to be in pediatrics or whatever, and they want to get busy doing it. They don't want to necessarily feel like they stood still without the support on whatever rotation. You've also got this phenomena that still occurs from what I understand, but it certainly did in my day, where you ended up in a rotation wheel, or a circumstance whereby you could get caught out 2 or 3 back-to-back rotations that are either fairly similar or not as rewarding or not as supportive an environment that's a long way away from what you want to experience. And you're then in a situation where you feel like you're stalling getting ahead on your career. You're not really able to get on with it. You don't have as much choice in that sort of system as you'd like. There are other circumstances now where people going in there are being able to, because it's more of a, there's the recruiting officers in these posts are often then sharking for top talent coming out of universities. And so I've heard circumstances where they've been able to say, yes, I'm willing to accept your job offer, but you've got to be quite assertive and say, well, I want to make sure I want these 3 rotations within this 2-year period or whatever. It's just a bold call, and it just takes for a fairly savvy individual to do that. But I have heard that happen, and fair play if you've managed to do it. But the amount of times that people do get caught out, getting dragged into rotations that they didn't want to do, or they kind of know that there's going to be rotations they don't fancy as much, but then if they end up with 2 or 3 then back to back and aren't able to get the experience that they were after, then that ends up being something that does stall their career. Some people aren't bothered about the career being stalled because it's on what's a year. For other people, that's massive. I don't want to waste a year, or what would feel like a waste of a year. So massive amount of variation to think about, and lots of different trade-offs that you need to consider that are individualized to you. Now, the other factor that I would put in here is then when it comes to just the assumption historically that, because the NHS dominates healthcare in the UK, rightly so. For those that don't know, I'm a massive fan of free at the point of access healthcare, and I'm passionate about that. It's an absolute political red line for me that we have an NHS that is free at the point of access and is funded through taxation. And therefore, doing so means that you've got the majority of physiotherapists in this country that are working in the NHS, and that is then assumed, especially as a junior, that you would go into the NHS system, and not to serve your time because it's a duty, but also it's just the way in which you will be exposed to the most variety of job logs, right? You just need to see what it is that the man or woman on the street then would present to physiotherapy with, having had a stroke or a arthritic knee or back pain or what have you, and how they end up in ICU, right, or in A&E. And so those different things mean that you've got that point. So there's this broader point of, should you have exposure and experience as a junior therapist in that, if you can get access to it. Now that means that, there are great MSK therapists out there that end up never having that exposure. You think of those that aren't physiotherapists, for example, that have difficulty accessing or being able to qualify for NHS roles. And so they still end up being brilliant MSK clinicians, and they manage to do so without this. But I think that when you have the opportunity to, seeing an NHS caseload of MSK, it's especially helpful. And also, as far as just in terms of getting to know your fellow citizens, working even in, say, respiratory or rehab or whatever it might be, with Joe and Josephine blogs, I think is a massive helpful shout, right? You want to get to know them and experience what they experience, and it helps you no end. Massive help. So there's that, right? So there's just, should I work in the NHS? I think if you can, I think that is really useful, really valuable. I don't think that's something that I would be willing to paint a quite broad brush on. Doesn't mean it's for everyone, but I think that there's something to be said for that having its own inherent perk, because there are other areas, namely the private sector, that you would just get completely, if you just saw your career out in the private sector or in sport, you could be completely blinkered to what it is that is a standard MSK presentation, or what the complex multi-comorbidities are, because people won't necessarily have the means, or would naturally go to where they've already paid for their care through taxation and default to that, and only ever see health professionals within that system. So you'll just not see that, and you could end up being really blinkered and biased. And I've seen that in some people that haven't had that experience. That doesn't necessarily then mean that you would naturally have to rotate within it, right? The static positions in various different disciplines exist, and at a junior level. And so if you feel like you know exactly what it is that you want to pursue, you're really quite confident that you would like to, then you need to be considering those options. And that's why when someone, without asking further questions, just says, just do your rotations, is pretty naff career advice, because it's so generic. One of the places it comes from, and this applies both sides, right? When someone says, don't worry about doing your rotations, the crap, or someone says, just do your rotations, best thing I ever did, you need to recognize where that's coming from. And it's often from a position of quite raw personal bias. There's also this professional bias that sometimes happens. You'll see senior clinicians that are very much benefit from, they don't realize it necessarily in themselves. Sometimes they do, they might be doing it in a calculated way, but they're saying that in part because they're passionate about people doing their rotations, because that's how they see forward their staff base, right? They're not just got a personal bias of saying it did me the world of good, and that's how you become a really well-rounded clinician like I am. But there's also people that are saying it because they want that to be the standard model, because the standard model benefits them professionally. And I'm not even blaming them for this. It's just that they do, right? They are part of a department that then gets its rotational staff through, and they might then struggle to recruit to that if it was having to be targeted, right? If they run a medical ward or a medical team, and they will be worried that juniors wouldn't think that would be sexy to apply for that role because they're all wanting to do something else, then they need their rotational staff. And so I completely understand that phenomena, but they need to own it. They need to admit it. They need to understand that that's colouring their opinion often on this. And sometimes that seems to be lacking, that reflection as to what it is that's informing it. Now, similarly, when this therapist that's saying, well, rotations are bollocks, it reminds me of people like numpties like Jeremy Clarkson will say every A-level results days, like, I failed everything and now I'm driving a Bentley and stuff, and he just has that brag. It reminds me a bit of that, where some people will say, like, I didn't do my rotations and look at me now. It's like, there's something to be said for that anecdote, but it's an anecdote and it's very individualized. And it means that therefore it might not be for everyone, but also it doesn't mean that that isn't just as bad an argument as someone saying, well, I did my rotations, best thing I ever did. It's like, You can bring them to the party and tell your story. That's fair enough, but it's not powerful evidence for the general. It's not powerful evidence for everyone. And so this is my point and my take on the whole thing. So what my position is when people say this, I've been changing over the years because it depends on the landscape of which you're graduating into. I think that if you're, especially if, let's just say, if you're really quite confident that you're into MSK, if you're following our stuff, if you're watching this show and you're a new graduate or a student, whatever, that you're clearly into MSK, rehab, that side of the world, rather than say medicine, acute neuro, that sort of stuff. It's not a perfect binary at all, but just generally speaking, you wouldn't be entertaining me and my lot as much if you didn't have a bias that way towards MSK, say sport, orthopedics, that sort of thing. Is that a specialized band 5 position, or even say sub-rotations within MSK disciplines for band 5s, I think with the right supervision, I think is a brilliant opportunity for you to get ahead in your career. I think that what you're lacking, depending on your student experience, I think if you've had a really narrow, you haven't had any breadth as a student, and you've always had weaknesses in say medical disciplines there, then that might be concerning. But as far as any gaps, there are ways in which you can do that. Understanding the nervous system in MSK never been more straightforward in many ways because of the way in which we kind of comprehend that better, and understanding how sort of pain is a phenomena, but also the importance of neurological function and that for safety and cranial nerves and stuff. You end up getting some of that. COVID's been helpful in a sense, understanding COVID and long COVID and how that's affecting cardiovascular systems means that you've got that. So there's upskilling you could do. Rheumatology, you need to be au fait with rheumatology, both for screening and for management, and therefore understanding sort of systemic factors that can affect people and understanding disease processes. So there's lots of ways in MSK that you could upskill in that direction. So I think that a specialized MSK position as a junior, if you are passionate about MSK and kind of confident that you want to go in that direction, is no bad thing. But again, it's with the appropriate support and governance. If someone said you've got a fairly isolated junior position for an MSK in MSK, or you've got a well-supported rotational environment with the senior supervision across the breadth of the rotations, I think that second part is a better option. Isolated is definitely second best, even if it's specialized, right? Again, for the reason I mentioned earlier about exposure, the ideal is that you would end up having that support. And then if you've got a supportive environment, it then becomes down to you. If you've got the right support, you've got the right system, you've got the right structure, the right employer, they're not struggling to recruit into the senior positions that would be then your educators and supporters and mentors, is that then it really is depending on what your career goals are, how much of a rush you're in, etc. And so I don't think in that environment with the right support and the right passion and interest and hunger to learn, I just don't think there's any reason that rotations would outweigh specializing, or that specializing would outweigh rotations. I just can't see it. I find that the arguments that suggest that without doing your rotations, you're therefore going to be more likely to miss serious pathology or more complex comorbidities and their interactions more later in your career. I see no evidence for that. I had a quick look at that a couple of weeks ago. I was interested in how things were going on Twitter when I first announced I was doing this show. And there were some people piping up to that effect. And I thought, I wonder if there is any sort of tentative evidence to that effect, that someone's going to miss that. I remember early in my MSK career, and there was sort of a more bizarre presentation, but with the right support. So someone was presenting with quite nondescript head and neck symptoms, and with the right support, my senior used it as a case study example for teaching me how they were breathing really shallow, and they were starting to get headaches and nondescript paresthesia into their head and neck and stuff. And it was just like, would I have seen that without their support or needed them at all if I'd have happened to have done respiratory rotations and stuff like that? Maybe. I'm not sure. I mean, it's not like I've missed it for a long time and was really concerned. It was just there was some complex case that presented itself, complex biopsychosocial case as to why she was anxious and she was shallow breathing and stuff. But then I could easily have not seen the wood for the trees regardless there, because it was misleading, because the main presentation was paid. So I could easily have been misled there. And, I feel like I was shoulder to shoulder with staff at that point that had done more rotations than me. By the way, I was rotational initially. I just didn't do a full set of rotations. But I specialised fairly early in MSK. I think 9 months in, I was specialised in MSK. But I was shoulder to shoulder with other clinicians that had done rotations, and I never felt like I was left behind on, say, medical or neuro knowledge, that the rotations that I hadn't done. And so that's just something to think about. So I think that tailoring is the most important thing for me, and my opinion on it becomes then, without knowing the details as to what someone's aspirations are, their life goals, their family circumstances, the hours that they want to work, means that I don't make assumptions anymore as to what is the best advice for them. They need to work that out themselves. But there's a weird phenomena whereby people like to imply that you're doing yourself and your career a disservice by not doing your rotations. They never bring any evidence to bear apart from their own personal anecdotes and stuff like that, which I'm not saying I'm diminishing those anecdotes. I'm just saying that they are their own, right? They're context specific factors affected by them and their variables. And much like if they were applying that to a patient and painting with too broad a brush on a patient, it wouldn't be fair. They need to consider that with the advice they're giving. Similarly, for those that are saying that rotations are bollocks and you don't want to go and do that because it's a waste of your time, and that's, again, it's narrow-minded on the other side. So I think that you need to tailor it, you need to be thoughtful, but you need to recognise that if you are a student or a new graduate and you have got world at your feet, you've got a lot of options, and you should then explore them, be thinking about them, be discussing them. As soon as someone sort of is being dismissive, or someone is sort of clearly heavily biased in a direction, then ask them some questions about why, what's colouring their opinion on that, what's making them assume that there is a good or bad. And I think it'd be really interesting, and I definitely would have them on the show if there's someone that feels like, well, I've met, I've been qualified for 20 years and I've met loads of different therapists, and those that have rotated are just head and shoulders above those that haven't. I want to hear from you. I've not seen it, I've not experienced it. I've met some absolutely fantastic clinicians, particularly in MSK, that I cannot comprehend that opinion. Some of the best clinicians I've met are of all different stripes and backgrounds and experiences and stuff. And I think that the hunger for learning is the most important one. So anyway, that's enough from me. Let me just riff on some of your comments then. So thank you so much for contributing. Ali Beverley, he'll be speaking. Ali's, I don't know if he's on tonight's webinar, but he's doing some of the work on our team. So had no choice when I graduated, but I'm hoping I'm men of one. You can't survive and succeed without having done rotation. Specialising doesn't mean you have to stop learning about other areas. You choose to do that. It kind of makes you hungry to go and learn more about that. I think he's really interested. Jim's then said you have to do respiratory so you can be on an on-call rota. Yeah, that is one of the things that really motivates people to get you onto a respiratory rotation early, is to get you on call and stuff. And people, and myself included, didn't fancy doing that, admittedly. Flicks then said, who's going to be leading the webinar tonight, so do tune in if you've already got a ticket, although it is sold out now, I'm afraid. Fortunately, we have 26 ward and 1 outpatient department. The rotations meant that you were not going to get your MSK quite as frequently as some would have liked. Let's get to some other more interesting comments than just the team riffing on stuff. Right, what's Jem saying here? I can't read the whole thing, but because of the job situation when I qualified in 2007, there were no jobs, no junior jobs, no rotations. I had to find my own way, finding local work in hospitals and rehab work in the military. So she's had a bit of a portfolio career as Gemma. And so she's clearly, I hope, then saying that she never did rotations and did okay, but it was down to her. She had to go and fight for it. So there might have been a simpler way of her doing it, but she's had to patch it together now. For those that don't know, Gemma Oliver, one of the most accomplished sports physiotherapists in the country in my book, and someone that's done gone a long way in a career and is very knowledgeable. And so there are sometimes you have to patch it up, and it sounds like Gemma had to scrap to do it, but there are ways. Donna Rayburn has said, I think you have very valid points and totally agree. It depends on the individual and their aspirations and experiences, with a smiley face. What a lovely comment. Thank you, Donna. That's really nice. I was expecting to be heckled a little more than I am doing, as far as I can tell, on the chat. Let's see what Joe Turner said, so maybe she'll heckle me. I didn't want to do rotations, but I have to say I enjoyed the support, which was great then. It allowed me to learn, to fail safely, to be young and stupid amongst peers who were in the same boat. Yeah, I agree with that, Joe. I think that's the case. And I think if you've I think that the stereotypical model that sometimes is touted when people say just do your rotations, I think it'd be difficult to oppose that if that was the reality. And so if there's people that feel that it still is, and you know, I think that would be fascinating to hear from you, because I don't see it that way anymore. I think that that support structure is not quite there. Even when by the time I qualified, I didn't recognise what had been sold to me as being what rotations were going to be, or preceptorship, or that this really supportive guided process that was essentially akin to an apprenticeship that you did your learning under the supervision of brilliant clinicians, etc. Jane Ashbrook, you might surprise yourself and find a real passion in another area, or I restrict your outlook straight from uni. There are such a variety of opportunities out there. I say embrace rotations and learn from many different experiences possible. And then what she said then? I didn't specialise for more than 2 years, learned more about MSK from respiratory mental health and community peds rotations than MSK outpatients. Right, so Jane is advising you and encouraging you to do your rotations, even though she didn't know about you. So I think Jane's painting with too broad a brush there. But her points, of course, are valid, as ever with Jane. But I just think that, yeah, you might surprise yourself, but you might not. And you might then waste your time. So I think that that's one of the things that I'm reflecting on, is that when, you know, Jane's opinion here, by the way, and it's a completely valid and fair opinion, is a very common one. And that it's really fair if you have some form of either indecision, or there's some reason as to why you're not wanting to hurry things along. I don't think, if I'm honest, I don't think I'd have stayed in the profession if I'd have got dragged too far away from where my passion laid. I don't know, like Jane's describing. And I really enjoyed my rotations when I did my first couple. But I went onto a rehab rotation out of trust, and therefore wasn't supported, but I got a lot out of it. And then I managed to say, because I'd done them a favour, I then brought I went into MSK. I was able to say, look, I've done you a favour by going out of trust on my first rotation and felt quite isolated, so can I have my MSK rotation? And the rest is history. So that was it. Jane's making a great point here. I mean, she's wrong, of course, but learning something new is never a waste of time. She's not wrong on that, but she's wrong in thinking that you would always learn something new on every rotation. There are some absolutely garbage rotations, and it doesn't mean that you're not going to learn anything, but it means that might not have been worth 6 months of your life. It just depends where you're up to and where you're at. And so that's the thing, and the point I'm making there, Jane, is that there are, unfortunately, and we hear from them, people that get caught in 2-3 rotations that are just a long way from where their passion is. They're often in touch with having to do a sort of CPD to stay fresh, right? So you graduate, and especially because I'm going to be honest, like we got a massively MSK centric material and audience. You're into MSK and sports rehab, and you then qualify with that passion. You go and do your rotations because that's what you've been told by Jane. Let's say you're inspired by Jane's point. You might surprise yourself. You might not. You go into a series of medical, respiratory, community, acute neuro rotations for 2 years. That's 4 rotations I've just named for 2 years. You then either rotate onto or decide, no, it turns out I do want MSK, I want that. And you might feel left behind. You might not have been able to apply that. Jane's saying you learn a lot about MSK and stuff. You're not applying it to knee pain. You're not applying it to managing complex psychosocial back pain. You're going to encounter that. People still have those as coexisting conditions, but you're not necessarily treating it in the environment that you might have intended. And so that's why, unfortunately, in certain circumstances, you might feel like you need to stand still. So that's why you need to individualize it. You need to consider your own aspirations, your own circumstances, and work out what's best for you. And feel free to grapple with all those variables. And you don't want to dismiss the idea of rotating out of hand, but you also don't want to dismiss the idea of specializing early. You've no idea it could work out well. And there are great examples of that. I'm somewhere in between, technically took a rotational job, didn't rotate much, and then specialize what would still be early if it's your first year of your career. But there are some that specialize straight out the gates that go badly, and then there's some that go from strength to strength. And so just bear that in mind as you consider your options discussions. If you've got a ticket tonight, then please do enjoy the webinar at 7 o'clock. Do tune in to that. That's by our clinical mentoring team for Physio Matters. Thanks a lot. If you've enjoyed this show, we'll do more to this topic and have more discussion and debate about it, because it is a contentious one. But for now, I will bid you farewell, and I will promise I will eventually sort out the outro music and stuff. Oh, I've gone 5 minutes over. Bye.